Good day, ladies and gentlemen. So I was off for a few days. Shout out to the Smiths. We had some friends visiting from the United States, and so I'm kind of back to work now. And as luck would have it, I think it was luck or providence, we should probably say, but as luck would have it, so to speak, I wasn't podcasting or whatever while they were here, which was good because this was when the Vigano stuff was coming down the pike. The accusations of schism and whatever. I had no real chance to podcast about it, which is probably good. I think I took a little bit of time. So we're going to go over this notion of Bishop Vigano being a schismatic. Now, I want to say this isn't going to be a very long show, maybe 20, 30 minutes. And my goal here today is not to go through chapter and verse all of Vigano's works. I'm going to have Matt Gaspers on from Catholic Family News on Thursday. We're going to be doing a deeper dive on sort of bring the receipts from what Vigano has said and what he's being accused of. But when this whole thing emerged, I saw a lot of opinions, and I realized there are a lot of legitimate opinions from people about the Vigano thing. You know, is he a schismatic? Has he gone too far? Some say yes, some say no. And it reminded me of information from this book, Ultramontanism and Tradition. I don't make a penny off of Os Justi Press books. I just love what Dr. K puts out over there. And this is I've talked about this book many times, but it's a really great book. I recommend getting it. A lot of different essays in here. Everyone from Bishop Schneider, Cardinal Burke, Dr. K is the editor, a ton of different scholars, Roberto de Matteo, Salmons, Charles Coulombe, Tim Flanders. Who else? Edward Fazer. Various scholars you may not be as familiar with because they're European and stuff. Things have been translated. Derek Taylor, Jose Ureta of Tradition Family Property. More and more. Lots and lots of great scholars. And Matt Gaspers is in here as well. And really, this book really does tackle, in many of its essays, the notion of a heretical pope. What has the church said historically about this? And what you find out, and they take, stuff from the first millennium, second millennium, what happened under Francis, it is really not as simple a question as people want it to be. I'm not a sedevacantist. I'm not convinced of the sedevacantist position. But there are positions that have been held historically, and we're going to get to an essay of John Lamont here. I think it's Dr. John Lamont, so I want to make sure. Is it doctor? I'm not sure, actually. Well, I don't like to miss it in case somebody is a doctor. But John Lamont, well-known traditional Catholic scholar, he's written a lot. And he has a really informative essay in here called Pope Francis is Public Heretic. And a version of this was originally published at Orate Celli last year. It's very extensive. It's like 25 pages. I'm not going to read the whole thing by any means. But there's some things in here that I want to go over because, you see, the crux of this thing to me tends to be because Bishop Vigano is being accused of schism, essentially because he rejects the Second Vatican Council. Although I don't think, which I find dubious, I'm not going to focus on that one today because I don't think Vigano says it was not a valid council that was called. I just think he believes it was ultimately heretical and whatever. I've done lots of stuff on the Second Vatican Council. That one to me is the easiest one to deflect because, and you can point to many things, but the council itself with the nota in Lumen Gentium talks about how the things in that document aren't definitive and they're understood in the history of the church, the way they have to be interpreted. And, Bishop Pozzo of the Ecclesia Dei Commission a few years ago, talking about SSPX conversations, was saying, yeah, there's certain things that don't have to be taken sort of as teachings, and Nostra Aetate and things like that. So the whole idea that, you don't sign on to everything in Vatican II as being the bee's knees, that's a pretty weak accusation by the admission of many things from the council itself. So that one I find strange. But the one that's got a lot of people howling is the idea that because Bishop Vigano has basically said Pope Francis is a usurper and the ape of the church and all this kind of stuff. And I want to go over this notion of, is someone really a schismatic if they believe a pope has become an anti-pope, or they believe Francis has sort of made himself illegitimate? There's a couple resources I want to go to. One is this essay here, and then we're going to look at something quickly from Crisis Magazine, a recent essay there. So let's dive into the information. But before we do, I want to remind you that I am going to Italy this fall. I haven't talked about it in a while. There's about a month and a half left to get your tickets. Thank you to the dozens of people that have signed up. But we're going to be going to Italy on a wonderful trip. If you want to go to a traditional Catholic pilgrimage, while the weather is very good in southern Italy, it's going to be November. It's not going to be too hot. The food is the best that time of year, by the way, because the harvest is, they have a later growing season. It's wonderful. And check the link in that. Check the link for that in the description area to this podcast. Okay, let's just get into this quick here, the points that I want to make. Okay, so this essay, what occasioned this essay was Pope Francis responding to some dubia. And it was from last year. And John Lamont, very legitimate scholar, believes that Pope Francis actually kind of put in writing legitimate heresy. So we're going beyond the airplane interview stuff and things. And we're not going to read all of it, but just to kind of make the point here. And in one part of his essay, he talks about how Pope Francis has asserted in writing heresies. And one of them he points to, which was a response to one of the dubia, Pope Francis wrote, "Both the texts of the scripture and the testimonies of tradition require interpretation in order to distinguish their perennial substance from cultural conditioning." And John Lamont is of the opinion that this contradicts the infallible teaching of the First Vatican Council. And he cites a bunch of different spots from the council, but one of them is an anathema. I want to bring that one up because anathemas are kind of a big deal. And the First Vatican Council wrote, and this is in De Filios chapter 4, and this is canon 3, and it says, "If anyone says that it is possible that at some time, with the progress of knowledge, a sense should be assigned to the dogmas propounded by the church, which is different from that which the church has understood and does understand, let him be anathema." I mean, consider this in the light of what Pope Francis said. Both the texts of scripture and the testimonies of tradition require interpretation in order to distinguish their perennial substance from their cultural conditioning. He's basically saying that dogma is relative to culture. So this is very different than what the First Vatican or the First Vatican Council anathematized, if you catch my meaning here. And I highlighted some really important parts here. At one point, Lamont says, "This position might be acceptable if applied solely to some non-infallible expressions of tradition, but Pope Francis does not apply it only to those non-infallible expressions. He applies it to all expressions of tradition whatsoever, which includes infallible teachings." And Lamont continues and he says, "The bare statement that not all of the content of any testimony of tradition needs to be accepted in its entirety is heretical," and it is. And he says, "The teaching of De Filios, which we read, asserts that the entire meaning of the dogmatic teaching of the church must be accepted by all Catholics at all times, in the sense that the teachings had when they were first made." He goes on to say, "Purely human assertions can contain erroneous elements because of the influence of the cultural and conceptual forms of their time. This is not true of God. The statements made by the scriptures and by sacred tradition are uttered both by God and by human beings. The fact that these statements are made by the free action of human will and human intellect does not make them any less fully and directly divine statements, since God is all-knowing and all-powerful. He can ensure that any statements that he makes in human language, using human instruments, are entirely free of error of any kind. Since he is perfectly good, etc., 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 his statements are free of any error. These are the reasons given by the First Vatican Council for holding that Catholic dogma cannot be mistaken, cannot change, and must be believed by Catholics. Pope Francis has claimed that all of the testimonies of tradition may contain erroneous elements because of the influence of the cultural and conceptual forms of their time, thus implies that none of these statements are divinely revealed. This is a grave heresy if this is true." In any event, he's got more examples in here about other things. This is just one. Other things Pope Francis has put in writing that legitimately seem to be heresy, and probably are. And this is a big problem. And he goes through sort of what's the conclusion of this. And I want to go to the nature of how heresy works, because Lamont in this essay, he's dealing with, okay, well, Pope Francis has written heresy. What are we supposed to do about that? Well, one of the statements that people will make is that, well, the Bible tells us that we're supposed to have people warned, and because there's nobody over Pope Francis, no one can really warn him in the same way. Well, that's not really true, because he can be warned by his cardinals. But also, it's just not true that in order to see someone as a heretic, it has to be an official declaration of the church. And he cites Cardinal Juan de Lugo, and this is an older thing. long time ago. And this is what this cardinal wrote, and this represents the constant teaching of the church on this subject. And he says, this is the cardinal from back in the day, and he says, neither is it always demanded in the external form that there be a warning and a reprimand as described above in the essay, for somebody to be punished as heretical and pertinacious. And such a requirement is by no means always admitted in practice by the Holy Office. For if it could be established in some other way, given that the doctrine is well known, given the kind of person involved, and given the other circumstances, that the accused could not have been unaware that his thesis was opposed to the church, he would be considered as a heretic from this fact. The reason for this is clear. The exterior warning can serve only to ensure that someone who has erred understands the opposition which exists between his error and the teaching of the church. If he knew the subject through books and conciliar definitions, much better than he could know it by the declarations of someone admonishing him, then there would be no reason to insist on a further warning for him to become pertinacious against its error. So, what we take from that? Well, there's really no way to say that Pope Francis wouldn't know that what he said was heresy or didn't have the ability to know, and ignorance can be sinful. And the problem is then we come to this understanding that it seems that the Pope is a heretic. I mean, this is, again, an opinion. And because it's possible. And we have to correspond and conform ourselves with reality. And Pope Francis has written things that definitely seem heretical on the very plain sense of it. And it's not necessary to have some sort of declaration from somebody else to say, well, we've established that he knew that it was heresy according to the mind of the church since the time before the council. John Lamont goes on to say there is moral unanimity among canonists and theologians that a pope who is a public heretic can and must lose the papal office. This is what Suarez states. It would be extremely harmful to the church to have such a pastor and not be able to defend herself from such a grave error. Furthermore, it would go against the dignity of the church to oblige her to remain subject to a heretic pontiff without being able to expel him from herself. For such as are the prince and the priests, so the people are accustomed to be. Now, but he goes on, relax, my Sede friends. He says, the unanimity, the moral unanimity amongst the theologians, the who's, also extends to the position that the Pope cannot be deposed by the church for heresy. Deposition is an act of a superior, and the Pope has no superior. The deposition of a Pope for heresy cannot be the implementation of canon law or heresy. The Pope is not subject to canon law as such, and in any case, this law describes the actions to be taken by superiors judging others, inferiors. The divine law, he says, on heresy indicated in the scriptures governs the situation of heretical pope. There is disagreement among theologians about what action, if any, the church must take to bring about the deposition of a heretical pope. No definite account of how a heretical pope must fall from office can be proposed as certainly correct. So John Lamont has an opinion here that I think is pretty reasonable. He basically says, listen, there is a moral unanimity amongst the legitimate theologians and the writings of the past that, a pope really, if he's a heretic, there's going to be something wrong with that. And also, you have to understand, too, is the fact that they're considering the fact that the Pope could be a heretic is proof that it's believed by the who's who that the Pope could be one. So those saying that there's no way he could ever utter heresy, it's just like, this isn't true. But at the same time, what to do with it, no one really knows. And therein lies the conundrum. So John Lamont, he says, he goes in a part in his essay here, what are the consequences of Pope Francis's heresy? And he says this. I want to make sure that we hammer this home. The public crime of heresy committed by the Pope is the worst form that this crime can take. This is because the Pope has a greater responsibility to preserve and uphold the faith than anyone else. And because open heresy on the part of the Pope causes more damage to the church than heresy committed by any other person. The gravity of Pope Francis's crime means that Catholics should follow the directions of the scriptures on the subject of heresy. Here's a very powerful line from John Lamont. They should recognize that Pope Francis has separated himself from the church through his heresy, and they should shun him as a heretic. He goes on to say, I do not myself think that the Pope has ceased to be Pope because of his heresy. He says, I'm not convinced of St. Robert Bellaman's claim that a Pope automatically loses the papal office as a result of heresy. However, this position is indeed a serious one that is held by many theologians and canonists. Since Pope Francis's heresy is not in doubt, the position that he is no longer Pope is also a serious one that cannot be dismissed. He says, the idea that the papal office is vacant as a result of its former occupant publicly embracing heresy is sometimes treated by Catholics as too horrifying to contemplate, and therefore as being impossible. It is not clear, though, why this possibility is more horrifying than the possibility of a heretical pope systematically using the papal office to attack the faith in the church. He says there is no good reason in any case to suppose that disaster cannot happen to the church. Anyway, the reason I brought this up is because what you do with a heretical pope is not simple. And you're not crazy if you've come to conclusions that Pope Francis is a heretic. Based on, and there's more in this book here. Again, I recommend it, but I'm not trying to go for an hour and a half here. And the scriptures tell us that if someone is a heretic, and remember, reading the theologian from ages past, the cardinal, representing the mind of the church in the subject and the writings of the theologians and so forth, that we don't need to have a canonical thing. It doesn't have to be, the trial of Pope Francis and they give a ruling or something like that. The divine writings, the scriptures, are very clear that we basically, when we establish somebody as a heretic, we just shun them as a heretic. So what does that mean? I don't know. I don't know what to do with that. And I don't think anybody really has the true solution. I know the Sedevacantists are going to say they do, but they don't. The Sedes are fighting with each other every 5 minutes and excommunicating each other and the Unicums and the whatever. It's a mess in Sedevacantist land, so it's not really the solution. I understand why very reasonable people hold it. I'm just saying, to say that it's a solution or the solution is just not true. Why am I bringing this up in the context of Vigano? Well, here's why. Bishop Vigano basically means basically, for his own reasons, believes that Pope Francis is an illegitimate pope for whatever reasons. From my mind, the fact that this question of a pope losing his office or not having the ability to become pope because he was already heretic or whatever the Vigano's argument is, to me, I don't see how this argument in and of itself can be intrinsically schismatic if it's something that the theologians have entertained as possible. I mean, we're talking about, again, in this book here, the mind of the greatest theologians and the testimony of scriptures and all these kinds of things. They're coming to conclusions that one could be able to tell if the Pope was a heretic, and the scriptures tell us to shun a heretic. What do we do with this? No one has the clear answer. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. No one has the clear answer. Vigano's opinion, whether it's mine or not, doesn't matter. Because I can look at Vigano's opinions about, and again, his opinions are not always clear, but I can look at this notion that he's rejected the legitimacy of Pope Francis, and I can say, to be honest, there's a defense for that. There's a defense for that, even if I don't agree with it. And I'm not saying whether I do or not, to leave you in suspense. And I want to bring up here an article from Crisis Magazine that came out the other day, which has some interesting information as well. So just give me half a second here. So here's an article by Aaron Sang, very good article, at Crisis Magazine. It is called, Can the Vatican Ban the Latin Mass? Catechism Says No. Very good article. And the reason I'm bringing this up, it's not directly about the Vigano thing, but there's information in here that I think is relevant. And right here, he says in the article, Perennial Catholic Catechesis maintains that we must respectfully comply with the commands of all legitimate superiors in the family, state, and church. That includes bishops, your father, the pope, mayors, presidents, whatever, kings, unless they are inducements to sin. While the explanations and examples of what qualifies as a sinful command provide a fascinating study in the catechetical tradition, we may sum them up neatly. Any order that undermines or contradicts right reason, natural or positive divine law, or the received doctrine, morals, and rights of the church must not be obeyed. I had a conversation this morning with Bishop Schneider, not about this topic. We were not talking about Bishop Vigano in any stretch of the imagination. We're talking about his new book coming out. That article, that interview will be released in a couple weeks or 2-3 weeks when the book comes out from Sophia. And we were talking about how this notion of obedience had been made basically too narrow to talk about only external compliance, which Aaron Singh also talks about this in this article. And he brought up the example of St. Athanasius, which everyone has talked about, but a lesser known story of St. Athanasius, where he was commanded by the Pope to basically make peace with, have an active exterior communion with bishops who were Arians in his region, and he said no. And he was exiled / excommunicated for saying no, for refusing to have communion with heretics. Because here's the thing. People will often say things like, we have to obey the Pope and all the superiors in everything but sin. Well, that's true, but what constitutes sin? I mean, it's a public scandal to have communion with heretics, isn't it? And obviously, Pope Liberius at the time was not claiming that those Arians were heretics, but Bishop St. Athanasius, he knew they were heretics because he knew Arianism was a heresy. And he just said no. History remembers those bishops as enemies. It remembers St. Athanasius as a hero. This is a simplistic overview, but what it demonstrates is, as this article says here, we'll bring it back up, not just things that are objectively say you must commit mortal sin. That's people kind of narrow it down to, but even any order that undermines, just degrades. Having communion with someone who's a heretic is degrading. And this contradicts right reason. And he goes on to give this example of St. Peter Canisius right here. Take the Catechism of the world-renowned Jesuit St. Peter Canisius. Familiar with hierarchs that harmed Catholic liturgy and undermined right doctrine, Canisius was sent to minister in the Archdiocese of Cologne when it was still being governed by the heretical Archbishop Hermann von Wied. In his large catechism written about that time, Canisius would write reprovingly of those who contemn the Church's customary teaching or rites of worship. And when asking what conception ought we to have of evil priests, he answers, and this is the money line, we do owe faith and obedience unto those only who, being lawfully ordained and sent by bishops, do profess the sound doctrine of the Church. But of others we must carefully beware, as of enemies and pestiferous persons. So he's saying that our obedience is, in a sense, conditional on what they're actually asking us to do and kind of how they are. And here he goes with the Catechism of the Council of Trent. It says in the Catechism of Trent, while it may seem strange, we are not excused from highly honoring wicked pastors, even when they show themselves hostile and implacable towards us. However, should their commands be wicked or unjust, so not just officially illegal, but unjust, they should not be obeyed, since in such a case they rule not according to their rightful authority, but according to injustice and perversity. And anyway, he goes on with more there. But the point is that this notion of legitimate authority, it's not as simple as somebody just holding an office. It's not as simple, and it's not as simple as a bishop just being a bishop or a pope just being a pope. The constant undermining, the demonstration of heresy, the demonstration of sacrilege and tyranny and so forth, if this becomes known and pertinacious, as it has with Pope Francis and bishops in the past and popes in the past, then these catechisms and these saints are very clear that, a person could make a clear conscience. And again, I'm not telling anyone what to do here. I'm not saying that, again, I'm not advocating one way or the other for Vigano's opinion. I'm just saying I can read this stuff that is a compilation of the Church's wisdom, and I can go, yes, superiors, and the Pope is a superior. You got to remember, the Pope does not exist in a category that is beyond the use of reason. He's a human being. He's not a god. People treat him as such, but he doesn't exist in some sort of extra category that is not governed by the laws of reality. He's still a human being with an infallible charism when he's teaching in certain ways, of course, but he's not given this like super magical power like people think he is. The nature of what law is does not change just because the Pope makes one. People have to understand these things. A law is governed by what governs just laws. It's metaphysical principles. It's Platonic forms, whatever thing you want to use. But the Pope doesn't get to circumvent these by some sort of magical superpower. So my point is that obedience is not just a manifestation of external compliance. Obedience is a virtue, and a virtue requires the will and intention and an object that is good in order for it to be a good, virtuous action. Obedience in itself is not good because you could obey the devil, to use an easy analogy. You could obey a wicked person telling you to do a wicked thing. It's also not as simple as, being told to do something that's not technically, objectively speaking, a mortal sin. It's also clear by the work of these theologians and catechism writers and saints and Aquinas and, all the Catechism of Trent. I mean, these very authoritative subjects and saints that even wicked commands or unjust commands or things that are undermining to the faith and so forth, someone can essentially lose their moral right to govern. They may not lose the office. We don't know what to do with that. I'm not giving a solution. I'm just saying it's more complicated than people want it to be. So the fact is that Bishop Vigano holds an opinion that many, many, many Catholics hold because of the scandals that have happened since the council, but especially under Pope Francis. And not just the moral scandals, not just the abuse cover-ups and things, but legitimate doctrinal scandals like his response to that dubia, which seems to be in flat contradiction with infallible teaching of the church. It seems to be heretical. And there's more in this book here. Again, I recommend finding that essay. You can also find it on Rorate Celli if you look up John Lamont from last year, but it's in this book here. I like books better than screens if I can. So what do we do with that? I don't know. As John Lamont says, there's a moral unanimity that a heretic pope would lose his office, but there's also a moral unanimity that we can't really do anything to depose him. And how can that happen? I have no idea. So these positions are not positions you approach with kid gloves. They are positions that are smart positions by smart, reasonable people that have been canonized and been catechisms and so forth over the centuries. You're not crazy if you think one of those positions is reasonable. So the crux of the matter here is that Bishop Vigano is being accused of schism essentially because he's rejecting the legitimacy of Pope Francis. While he has reasons to reject the legitimacy of Pope Francis based on a lot of the wisdom we find in the writings of the greatest saints and theologians in the church's history. Again, one could offer a contrary opinion. I'm just saying the opinion in favor of a Vigano type position, because he hasn't gone dogmatic sedevacantist in sort of the 1958 sense. He's just talking specifically about Pope Francis in a kind of different way. This is an opinion that someone might hold, and I can't call it intrinsically schismatic. I just can't, because how could I? I mean, someone coming to the conclusion that Pope Francis is essentially an anti-pope when there have been anti-popes in history, and they'll say, well, those times of anti-popes were different. Yeah, they were different. But those times that had anti-popes were different than the times before them when they didn't have anti-popes either. So they're always different. But when you're following the sound reason and doctrine, you can arrive at these conclusions as a reasonable person who has no intention of being a schismatic and no intention of, because you got to understand too, schism and heresy and apostasy, these are all sins. In order to be a sin, you have to have an intention and do something that's intrinsically evil or do something in an evil way that it shouldn't be. And you have to do that on purpose for it to be a sin. This is the basics of moral theology about what constitutes sin. So again, I'm not defending everything Bishop Vigano has said about everything. I haven't read everything he's written, and I'm not going to give a blanket statement about everything he's written, good or bad. I'm just saying in this particular instance, I can't tell you how many Catholics I've talked to who think Pope Francis is an anti-pope. Both trads and Novus Ordos. People who are TLM attendees and people who are not. I mean, I don't believe the Benedict thesis, the Pope Benedict was still Pope thesis. I don't believe that at all. But many Novus Ordo people follow that thesis, and I don't think they're schismatics. I don't think they're right, and I've argued against it with Matt Gaspers on my channel, but I do not think they're schismatics because they have no desire to reject the primacy of the Pope. They just have an opinion about something in a crazy time that is the conclusion of which would mean Pope Francis isn't the Pope. I don't think they're schismatics. I think that they're confused, and I'm not saying that as an insult. I'm saying because we're all confused, because what's going on right now is confusing. Now, it may very well be that Bishop Vigano may cross a line, and maybe we'll have a different reason to reevaluate and stuff. But again, Anthony Stein talked about this a few days ago. That was one of the shows. I watched him and Marshall on this, him and Taylor. And, what Bishop Vigano is saying, he's of the opinion that the sort of ape of the church thing is going on, the counterfeit church. This is also something you find in saints and prophets and theologians and mystics and stuff. And And these things have been read and understood and cogitated upon by Catholics of goodwill for centuries. But the fact that we're going through something right now that looks like it makes people nervous. And again, it should make us nervous in the sense of, whoa, it's kind of crazy. But again, I can't say that Bishop Vigano is a schismatic. I can't do it. I can't do it when I look at this stuff, even if I don't hold his opinion. And I'm not telling you whether I do or not, because of the sound theology that is behind the possible and debatable and defensible positions that arrive at conclusions like the one that Bishop Vigano has. So of course, he's not going to accept Pope Francis's ruling because he believes he's illegitimate based on reasons that are pretty legitimate and based on how the nature of authority works. And this mess is not going to be cleaned up until the church is cleaned up. Now, I also don't think Bishop Vigano is like Archbishop Lefebvre. I think his criticisms of Vatican II are very similar, which are common amongst a lot of traditionalists. I mean, even Bishop Schneider, who I was talking to this morning, doesn't hold the same views as Vigano and everything, but Bishop Schneider defends Archbishop Lefebvre's criticisms of Vatican II and seems to hold the same ones. I don't know if every jot and tittle of Vigano and Lefebvre's criticisms of Vatican II are the same, but I'm just saying, but I don't think he's a carbon copy of Lefebvre. Again, totally different scenario. Lefebvre had started an order and was doing different things and more practical things from a younger age. Vigano's in his 80s now. By the time Lefebvre was in his 80s, he'd already been in his sort of second career for about 20 years, doing a lot of things like that. So they're very different men in many ways. So I'm not going to compare the two in a one-to-one sense. But again, I don't have to, because as Dr. K, he gave a talk one time, I can't remember which one. It might have been about something like the state of obedience in the church or during the crisis or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But he basically said something that I thought was very insightful. And he said, every time during the church history when there's a crisis, it's a lot like crisis from the past, but it's also not. So again, this anti-pope situation, potential situation that many people believe of goodwill, many bishops and priests and Novus Ordo traditional that I've talked to, they have this opinion. It's not like the time of the anti-popes of the Great Western Schism, but the time of the Great Western Schism was not like the time before that either. So you just kind of have to go through it and come out the other side and see if you can make sense of it. And I think we're in one of those situations right now. So lastly, I'll say I don't think Bishop Vigano is a schismatic based on the fact that he has, I think, legitimate reasons. But someone may disagree with me, and I'm not going to excommunicate or call someone a schismatic for having a different opinion on that. That's what the Novus Ordo Pope Francis apologist podcasters do, because they're so filled with charity. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you today. I'm going to be back with Matt Gaspers on Thursday. Maybe I'll do something tomorrow as well. As always, my friends, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been Mere Tradition with Kennedy Hall. I will see you next time.